Everyone has seen the Axios report. Everyone has heard that Donald Trump exploded on Benjamin Netanyahu in a phone call, dropped multiple expletives, and told the Israeli prime minister he was, quote, crazy. The headlines ran with it for 2 days straight. The cable shows dissected the tone. The commentators argued about whether Trump was angry or just posturing. But here is what most of you have not heard. 5 days before that call leaked, John Bolton sat down and told you exactly what Trump has done to the machinery that was supposed to control every American president. And a few hours after the Netanyahu story broke, Trump quietly put a housing official in charge of the entire United States intelligence apparatus. And last weekend, Pete Hegseth walked into the empire's own defense conference in Singapore and tore up the rule book they had been writing for 80 years. These three things are not separate stories. They are one story, and nobody in mainstream media is connecting the dots. I'm Susan Kokinda. I've been watching the architecture of American foreign policy since the 1970s. I was on the ground in Washington when the national security bureaucracy was being assembled piece by piece, and I know what it looks like when someone starts taking it apart. That is exactly what we are watching right now, and the panic from London to Ottawa to the Council on Foreign Relations tells you everything you need to know about how serious this dismantling actually is. Today, I am going to show you exactly why the Netanyahu call reveals something far deeper than a spat between two leaders, who Bill Pulte really is, and why his appointment to run United States intelligence is the most significant power shift in a generation, what Hegseth actually said in Singapore, and why the establishment buried the real substance of that speech, and what the Council on Foreign Relations just confessed that proves the old order is not just changing, it knows it is dying. If that sounds like your kind of truth, hit subscribe and stay with me. According to reporting from Axios' Barak Ravid, published June 2nd of this year and confirmed by President Trump himself on a New York Post podcast the following day, Trump called Netanyahu during a critical window of United States and Iran negotiations and ordered him to stand down from planned strikes on Beirut. A United States official summarized Trump's message as follows. He told Netanyahu he would be in prison if not for him, that he was saving Netanyahu's position, and that everyone now hates Israel because of what is happening in Lebanon. The Times of Israel. A second source briefed on the call said Trump was, quote, pissed, and at one point yelled at Netanyahu directly, demanding to know what he was doing. Axios Trump confirmed the call on Wednesday, telling reporters he was not angry so much as perturbed by Israel's constant fighting with Lebanon, and said he told Netanyahu they needed to stop. Axios, according to a second United States official, Trump had steamrolled Netanyahu on the call entirely. Netanyahu's reported response was simply, okay, just make sure everything is taken care of. The Daily Beast. Now, some voices on the right, including Fox News host Mark Levin, pushed back hard on the Axios reporting, calling it largely fabricated and demanding accountability for the anonymous sources. That skepticism is noted. But Trump himself confirmed the substance of the call. He confirmed he pushed back on Netanyahu. He confirmed the ceasefire directive. Whatever the exact wording, the power dynamic was real. The confrontation came just hours after Netanyahu and his defense minister ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to strike terrorist targets in Beirut's southern suburbs, following days of sustained Hezbollah rocket and drone attacks on northern Israeli cities. And critically, Iran had already threatened to abandon nuclear negotiations with Washington over Israel's military actions in Lebanon, with Tehran insisting that any deal must also cover the situation there. United with Israel, the Daily Beast. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the real story isn't what you just heard. The media framed this as Trump losing his temper, as a crack in the United States and Israel relationship, as evidence that Trump's Middle East policy is unraveling. But that framing misses the entire point. Do you think Donald Trump convened a subcommittee before he made that phone call? Do you think he circulated talking points through the National Security Council and waited for a consensus recommendation? He did not. He decided, and then he acted. Think about that. That is the presidency as it was designed to function. One person, personal responsibility, direct action. And it is precisely what the permanent national security apparatus spent 80 years engineering out of the Oval Office. John Bolton spelled this out himself 5 days before the Netanyahu call became public. In an interview that the media largely ignored in favor of the more dramatic leak, Bolton complained that Trump has dismantled the National Security Council decision-making structure, that the president just sits behind the resolute desk, says what he wants to do, and his cabinet officials say, "Yes, sir, we will do that." Bolton described this as dysfunction. Bolton described this as dangerous. But here is what Bolton was actually mourning. He was mourning the Brent Scowcroft paradigm, the system in which a president is presented with options by the permanent intelligence bureaucracy, given cost-benefit analyses assembled by career officials with their own institutional loyalties, and then, only then, makes a decision within the parameters that the apparatus has already framed for him. That is not a president making decisions. That is a president ratifying decisions that have already been made for him by people he did not elect and cannot fire. And Bolton said the quiet part loud. He said that when Trump leaves office, the Reagan-Bush wing of the party will win back control. He called Trump an aberration. That word is doing enormous work. An aberration is something the system is designed to survive and then correct. And that tells you everything about how the establishment views this moment. Now ask yourself, if Trump is just an aberration, why is the panic this intense? Because of Bill Pulte. On Tuesday, June 2nd, President Trump announced he was appointing Bill Pulte, the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency and chairman of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as the new acting director of national intelligence, replacing Tulsi Gabbard, who is departing at the end of June. NPR. Pulte has been one of the most controversial members of the administration. In his housing role, he sent criminal referrals to the Justice Department alleging mortgage fraud against several of Trump's political opponents, including New York's Attorney General, a United States Senator, a Federal Reserve Governor, and a sitting congressman. All four have denied wrongdoing. CBS News Pulte does not appear to have any prior national intelligence background. ABC News analysts fear the appointment could further politicize the office and erode United States intelligence gathering capabilities. One former CIA veteran described the appointment as emblematic of the administration having no respect or need for the traditional DNI function. CNBC. The reaction was immediate and bipartisan. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, the top Republican in the chamber, told reporters directly, "We do not need a weaponized DNI. We need professionals there." Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called Pulte a partisan operative with no intelligence experience. CNBC. Now here is what they don't want you to understand. That bipartisan panic is the confirmation. When both the Republican establishment and the Democrat opposition unite to denounce a single appointment, it means that appointment threatens something they both benefit from protecting. What they are protecting is the arrangement. The arrangement that J.D. Vance described precisely when he explained why Pulte was chosen. Vance said, and I am quoting directly here, that Bill Pulte recognizes the bureaucracy of the intelligence community must respond to elected leadership rather than the other way around. Read that sentence again. For the better part of a century, the intelligence apparatus managed American presidents. It framed their options. It controlled what they knew and when they knew it. It built the context within which every presidential decision was made. Whoever controlled the intelligence controlled the presidency. And Trump just put his own loyalist at the top of that entire structure. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence has already undergone major restructuring under Gabbard, reducing or reassigning staff by 40% and consolidating several offices through what the administration called an ODNI 2.0 initiative. Now Pulte comes in to continue and accelerate that process. The establishment's own pipeline to the Oval Office is being systematically dismantled, department by department, appointment by appointment. CBS News. Here's where it gets really dangerous, if you are part of the old order. Because while the intelligence community was melting down over Pulte, Pete Hegseth was in Singapore doing something equally historic. The annual Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore is Asia's premier forum for defense leaders, militaries, and diplomats. This year's 23rd edition was the first indication of United States policy direction in the Indo-Pacific since Trump's summit with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Beijing. The forum is run by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is itself a direct offshoot of Chatham House, the London-based think tank that has shaped the Anglo-American foreign policy consensus since the 1940s. South China Morning Post. The sponsors expected a predictable speech, strong language on China, a firm commitment on Taiwan, the usual architecture of the rules-based order reaffirmed from a new stage. They did not get that speech. Hegseth became the first Pentagon chief in more than a decade to avoid mentioning Taiwan by name during his main address at the forum, which lasted approximately 30 minutes. The press immediately framed this as weakness, as a concession to Beijing, as evidence that Trump was abandoning Taiwan. Fortune. But the silence on Taiwan was not the story. Hegseth told the assembled defense ministers, military chiefs, and diplomats that a Pacific dominated by any hegemon would unravel the regional balance of power and undermine the equilibrium they all seek to preserve. He described a United States strategic posture built not on confrontation, but on what he called measured and deliberate strength. He said United States interests in the Pacific are significant, but also scoped and reasonable, defined by a favorable balance of power in which sovereignty is respected, commerce flows freely, and nations retain the freedom to make their own choices. NPR. Did you hear that? A favorable balance of power in which sovereignty is respected, and nations retain the freedom to make their own choices. That is not the language of the rules-based order. The rules-based order is not about sovereignty. It is about compliance. It is about nations accepting a set of rules handed down from Washington and London, rules that sustain the financial architecture of Western dominance and keep regional powers perpetually managed against each other. What Hegseth described is something entirely different. It is a world in which the United States operates from interest and principle rather than from the role of global policeman for an imperial financial system. Hegseth's speech was described as more moderate on United States and China relations compared to his appearance at the same event last year. Chinese delegates, according to reporting from Fortune magazine, were generally satisfied that the forum did not turn into a staging ground for direct United States and China confrontation as it had in previous years. And critically, Hegseth's framing of a potential stable peace with Beijing, built on fairness and reciprocity, landed in a room full of people who built their entire careers on maintaining the opposite dynamic. South China Morning Post. Because the empire runs on tension. It always has. Now let's go deeper. The Council on Foreign Relations, which is Chatham House's American institutional twin, founded in the same period after the First World War as part of the same Anglo-American coordination project, is running what it calls a multi-year research project titled The Future of American Strategy. One of its first publications is by Gideon Rose, a career CFR man who served on Bill Clinton's National Security Council. The piece is titled After Hegemony. Rose describes what the old system was built on. He writes about the international order that emerged from World War II as a kind of social contract, a system premised on the philosophical framework of Hobbes and Locke, two thinkers presented in every Western political science curriculum as the founding intellectuals of liberal democracy. Here is what they leave out of that curriculum. Thomas Hobbes was a shareholder in the Virginia Company in the 17th century. He was a stakeholder in colonial extraction from the very beginning. And John Locke, whose famous social contract gave us life, liberty, and property, was secretary to the Council of Trade and Plantations, the body that managed Britain's colonial empire. He was a shareholder in the Royal African Company. That company transported approximately 150,000 enslaved Africans. His famous category of property, the right the government existed to protect, included human beings. The translation of that is simple. The philosophical foundations of the rules-based international order, the moral framework that Bolton and Carney and the Chatham House crowd and every CFR publication has been defending, were written by the intellectual servants of British colonial slavery and extraction, not by idealists, by operatives. Our founding fathers said something different. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not property, not the right of the stronger party to extract from the weaker in exchange for a degree of managed security. The pursuit of happiness, meaning the human capacity to create, to build, to act in the image of something higher than fear and competition. That is not Hobbes. That is not Locke. That is the philosophical tradition that actually produced the American Republic. And that is what Donald Trump, consciously or not, is reasserting. Now let's talk about who is winning. Trump's position is this: the presidency belongs to the person who holds it, not to the apparatus around it, not to the intelligence bureaucracy that frames its options, not to the think tank ecosystem that manages its strategic doctrine. The president decides. The cabinet executes. The bureaucracy serves. The old order's position is that Trump is an aberration, that the National Security Council process, the Permanent Intelligence Community, the Atlantic Alliance, and the multilateral institutions they built are the real continuity of American power, and that Trump will be corrected by history. Here is where the scoreboard stands right now. Trump forced Netanyahu to stand down on Beirut, not through a committee recommendation, through a direct call. Iran's negotiations with the United States are still alive. Bill Pulte is now sitting atop the United States intelligence community with a mandate to make it answer to elected leadership. And Pete Hegseth just stood on the empire's own conference stage and described a world order based on sovereignty and balance of power rather than Anglo-American managed rules. That is not the behavior of a man who is losing. On the other side, Bolton is giving media interviews, mourning institutions he can no longer influence. The Council on Foreign Relations is publishing papers titled After Hegemony. Senate Majority Leader Thune can express displeasure about Pulte, but he cannot stop the appointment. And Chatham House's Singapore Forum just heard an American defense secretary describe their entire post-war architecture as a failed globalist project. Best case scenario, Trump completes the restructuring of the intelligence community. The Iran deal holds, Lebanon stabilizes, and the new American strategic doctrine of sovereignty-based balance of power takes root in both the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. The old guard loses its institutional grip permanently. Worst-case scenario, the intelligence establishment, the congressional old guard, and allied foreign intelligence services, particularly in London, Mobilize hard enough through the remaining institutional channels to block, delay, or reverse the restructuring. A manufactured crisis in Taiwan, Lebanon, or Iran gives the interventionists the pretext they need to reassert the Scowcroft paradigm. Most likely scenario: the fight continues at exactly this intensity through the rest of this year and into the 2026 midterms, with each appointment, each phone call, and each speech representing another yard gained or lost in a war that the establishment desperately wants you to think is just about personality and temperament. It is not about personality. It was never about personality. But here is the bottom line. What you are watching is not a series of impulsive decisions by an unpredictable president. You are watching a deliberate and systematic dismantling of the apparatus that kept the American presidency on a leash for 80 years. The Netanyahu call, the Pulte appointment, the Hegseth speech, they are all expressions of the same doctrine. The president decides, the cabinet executes, the intelligence community serves elected leadership, and American strategy is built on sovereignty and balance of power, not on British imperial philosophy dressed up in democratic language. John Bolton and Gideon Rose are writing the obituaries of one world. Donald Trump is building another. So ask yourself this: if this is just an aberration, why is London writing the panic pieces? Why is the CFR publishing After Hegemony? Why does it take both parties in the United States Senate to condemn one housing official getting a temporary appointment? The answer is obvious. This isn't an aberration. This is a reckoning. Drop your thoughts below. Is Trump winning this fight for the presidency, or is the apparatus going to outlast him? I want to know what you think. And if you want to stay ahead of how this story develops, subscribe and hit the bell, because this fight is accelerating and the next 90 days are going to be critical.